So good to see so many familiar faces. So yay, yay for taking the time out to be here. And gosh, I just want to catch up with you all. So it's just great to see you all. Um, I love February. I even wore my bright, February colors because it's so much about love. And it's so much about celebrating um, all the things that we love. So the anti-cancer way of life is something that I absolutely love to get to share. It's a celebration truly of how do we maximize life so we can love more. And so what I really want to cover really in this month of February, but specifically today, is kind of an overview, kind of a snapshot of where we are. It's so easy to get lost in the weeds. I'm famous for that because I love to study about bone health. I love to study about all the details in the science world. But I think sometimes it's really cool to step back and go, okay, where are we today with the research around an anti-cancer way of life? So what I hope that you really take away today is some really key elements that stand out to you when we talk about cancer and the etiology. We talk about how it relates to our environmental exposure as well as our genetic predisposition. And then what can we do with what we have? Meaning, what can we do with our lifestyle that will truly affect the trajectory of our quality of life? And of course, morbidity and mortality. We all know someday we're going to get to die and go to heaven, but we'd like it to be as fast and as clean as simple. We're healthy on Tuesday and Wednesday we get to go to heaven. None of the sickness in between, right? So that's what we shoot for. So, like I mentioned, we want to know about confronting the cancer disease process. So we'll cover a little bit about that today. And of course, there's so much we don't know. And that's something I want us to keep in mind, that we still are learning a ton. And so staying abreast of that, I think, is so cool. And what's so nice is, in this world of knowledge at our fingertips with the internet, I think the toughest challenge really is knowing what resources to trust, where to get the most valuable information. But we'll talk about that a little bit today. And then the working of the body's natural fighting capacity. So I love the fact that we have the most amazing physiology that truly does help fight off the growth of cancer cells. And then, of course, understanding factors in our lifestyle and environment that affect our health and ultimately, the longevity and really the quality of our life. So what do we know about the cancer and how it gets started in the body? A normal cell sustains a damage to the DNA. And so it affects how it grows, how it divides, and then even how it dies. A normal part of cell death, just like humans, is the healthy dying process and then replacement. And so instead, it begins to act independently. And a very amazing phenomenon to me is that the normal healthy cell just transforms into this, crazed cell that has its own way of behaving. And remember that it's a process. It's not a single event. So it doesn't happen right away. So there's certainly so many opportunities and steps where intervention can happen. So cancer cells are metabolic opportunists. And what do we mean by that? Well, when there is opportunity that allows that growth to happen is when it happens. So how do we have that environment that allows for this opportunity? So excess fuel is a big one. So creating insulin resistance is something that's super important. And I really want you to write that down and circle it and put stars all around it. What do we mean by insulin resistance? How can we affect it? And how, of course, can we control it? In addition to insulin going up, there's another chemical, IGF, that also stimulates growth. And so that's something that we also really want to be careful with. And when that happens, when insulin goes up, the secondary effect is often that the IGF-1, which is that powerful growth signaling, increases. And that promotes cell division. Now, normally, we want our cells to grow and repair. Cell division is a healthy thing, but not when it's in the presence of too much IGF-1 and the insulin resistance. That just means that the insulin can't do its job. It can't get the blood sugar into the cells. For some reason, it hangs out in the bloodstream too long, and that's how we get elevated blood sugar. So insulin resistance is really a double-edged sword. One, that your insulin that you have isn't working as well as it should. And the second part is the cells can't get the nutrients that it needs to be healthy and functioning well. So decreasing the death of the cell is what we have to be careful of, because if the wrong cells die too quickly because they can't get the nutrients, that's bad. And if we can't kill off the bad cells that need to die, that's bad. So those regulators are what's so key, and insulin is a big driver of that, as well as the IGF-1. So a cancer starts when the safety mechanisms fail. And again, we are so lucky that we have lots of safety mechanisms. We all come in contact with potential carcinogens every day. Sad part is we just don't know, right? There's so much we don't know. And so we're lucky that we do have mechanisms that normally kick into place and help us stay safe. Random copy errors of the DNA is really what we have to worry about. Random copies that aren't supposed to be there. Chemical disruptors also are part of the problem. What do I mean by chemical disruptors? Well, we're learning that a lot of chemical disruptors are in our environment. You know, we've heard a bit about the toxins from agriculture, pesticides and herbicides. Those are an example of chemicals that do a good job killing plants that we don't want, but we really don't want them in our system. Glyphosate is probably one that you've heard of a lot, and that's certainly one that we're concerned about. So we got to be careful about knowing where they are and how to avoid them. And then radiation. You know, we are told we have to get our annual checkups, and we have to get x-rays and PET scans and CAT scans if, you know, you're going down the path of diagnosis. And most of them are very low, but you sure don't want to have radiation if you don't have to. And then the other one, this is a really big issue, chronic inflammation. What do I mean by that? You know, inflammation is a good response. That's when our body is creating white blood cells, all of the immune cells that help us fight off disease or bacteria or those cells that go awry. So when it's chronic inflammation, something is definitely not working like it should. So the concern is, what's causing this chronic elevation in our white blood cells? I have a thyroid issue. When I first got pregnant, I had thyroid dysfunction. Who knows what caused this thyroid dysfunction in my probably childhood? So it's hard to know what causes this chronic inflammation, but somehow the DNA is affected with our cells that produce our immune cells. And so that's what causes this inflammation. So there's some things we can control and some things we can't. So I can't go back in time and fix what happened to my thyroid. But I can look at lifestyle opportunities now and make my best decisions going forward. And then there's a growth signaling that sometimes gets stuck on, and sometimes the signaling that gets stuck that won't turn it off. So like the brakes get stuck. They don't do their job of stopping the reproduction of cells. That's, of course, not a good thing. And so this is why we start to see issues that are red flags. So if we get fatty liver disease, well, what's happening there? Our liver is struggling. Why? Because there's too much substrate in the liver and it gets clogged up. Just a quick little anatomy of our digestion. Everything we eat, we masticate, so chewing, that's the first stage of digestion. And then we swallow it, forms a big bolus with some saliva, and it goes down a little farther into the duodenum, gets some more digestive juices, and of course the stomach, the HCl, drops the pH really, really low. Pretty soon, all the foods that we eat go into the liver. First, storage depot and repackaging depot. So everything we eat impacts the liver, as well as medicines and, you know, other toxins. So when we think about the liver, it's really important that we take good care of it. So what we eat has an impact on the liver. And then there's GERD. You know, there used to be a couple of medicines. My very first job in California, I ran a hospital food program, the nutrition department of this rehab hospital. And I remember Prilosec was this really intense, very effective medicine for GERD. And you could only get it by a prescription because it was so powerful. You know, there's always pros and cons to medicine, right? And so doctors only wanted to give Prilosec if it was absolutely necessary because the side effects were pretty serious. And now you can practically get it over the counter. Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, so things change because there's such a problem. So many people have this issue of esophageal reflux, and that causes a lot of issues. Always scratchy throat, affects your voice, starts to affect issues. And so that's an example of chronic inflammation because the digestive juices are splashing up into the esophagus and causing irritation. As mentioned, you know, the stomach is really good at doing what? Decreasing the pH. The best digestion happens in the stomach when the pH gets to be about 2. That's very acidic. That would burn our hand, but it is okay in the stomach. Why? Well, because we have a nice thick mucosal layer that protects it. But if that digestive juice splashes up into the esophagus, it causes burning, and that happens over and over and over. Now we have this potential for those damaged cells to then have damaged DNA that then can be an opportunity for those cancer cells to then take root because those cells have been damaged. So it's just a sort of an insidious process that we don't really notice. If you have a friend or you know somebody that clears their throat all the time, you know, that is a real warning sign that maybe there's some splashing and they don't necessarily feel it. They might not feel like they have a sore throat or have an issue. And it could just be allergies. It could be, you know, coming from the sinus cavities, but, you know, it's worth checking. And then the big question is, well, what am I doing to my body that might be causing or exacerbating this splashing up? And I remember one time when I was a trainer at Lifetime Fitness and I had this darling lady as a client, and we were helping her with weight loss. And I gave her a plan to try, and it was much smaller meals than what she was used to. And she came to me one time and she said, Suzanne, I can't believe how much better I feel when I don't eat all this. I don't have to unbutton my pants anymore after a meal or go take a nap. And it's just because she had never really tried eating a smaller amount. She'd just been taught that you eat what's on your plate, you eat what's given to you, and there's starving people in China, and don't waste any. You know? And it was so cute that she was just like, wow, I didn't know I could feel this good. And probably if she had kept going, she might have been a good candidate for GERD, because when the stomach overfills, what happens? Well, the sphincter muscle at the top gets weaker and weaker, and it makes it easier and easier for those fluids to splash up into the esophagus. So yeah, she was adorable. And she did have successful weight loss. Yeah, she was such a cute lady. I still keep in touch with her. So then the next one, obesity. This one is huge. The number 2 risk factor for cancer next to smoking. And you know, when I read that statistic, I was really surprised that that could be so significant. And we could even take it a step farther and say that obesity could in fact be the number 1 cause of all the chronic diseases. Can you think of one that it wouldn't affect? Maybe osteoporosis, because of course if you're heavier, it does help your bones, but heart disease, you know, all the things related to cardiovascular, so lung and strokes, atherosclerosis are all impacted by weight. And so for sure, we know diabetes is affected by weight. Now, of course, we know some people that have diabetes that are very thin, whole different kind of diabetes, right? But this one is referring to usually because of insulin resistance. So here's that phrasing again. When our body doesn't do a good job with getting the sugars out of the blood into the cells, that creates a cascade of events that turns into metabolic syndrome and even obesity. Metabolic syndrome is just, kind of the first stages of your body really suffering because of that insulin resistance. So if we have um, blood sugar that is always right around 100 fasting, or maybe 98, and the doctors don't really even highlight it. You're below 100, you're okay. But really, my goal would be to get you lower than 80. The lower the fasting sugars, the better. Within reason, of course, but 60 even. If your body's used to it being that low, could be A-okay. What we know for sure is that if it's above 90, yellow flags ought to be going up, because that means that there's probably some insulin resistance going on. So it's something that I hope your healthcare team and your friends and family healthcare team starts to be a lot more aggressive at looking at what is your fasting sugar, and can we treat a fasting sugar that's 90 with simpler tools instead of medicine? Because true, maybe at a fasting blood sugar of 90, you don't need to, have metformin or insulin. But what if at a fasting blood sugar of 89, your doctor said, you know what, be careful. And then you started doing some things differently in your lifestyle. Remember, those things we can control are way over here, and we want to use those before we have to use medicines, before we have to deal with GERD or fatty liver and having to take Prilosec or metformin for frank diabetes. I've had many clients that had a blood sugar of 102 fasting, and they say, oh, I don't have diabetes. And, I don't want to contradict them, but in my mind, I'm thinking, yeah, but you probably have pre-diabetes, and so that one becomes such an important thing to be able to track. So, how do we know? I love these guys. This is an old slide, and I just think they're so cute. How do we know what to track? How do we know what to look for when we're evaluating our health, both the environmental health and our own physiology? Something that really scares me, and you might not have all these slides. I think you do have this one, but I always like to add more. So you can just take notes on those pages, I hope. But when we look at these organizations, the HHS, the Health and Human Services Organization, is tasked with helping learn about humans, learn about physiology, so that we can make sure Americans get the most information possible. So the International Agency for Cancer Research, as well as the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health, the FDA, the American Cancer Society, and ultimately your doctor. So it kind of goes from a really big swath of knowledge to the very individual, which is you and your doctor. And what I always hope for is that you become an active role in your care, so that you work with your doctor and really get some good plan of being proactive. So let's look at these a little bit more. You'll see it in two ways, not the National Toxicology Program or report. And again, it's an agency that's not that old. It was built in the late 70s, and they look at substances with the absolute goal of understanding public health risk. It's really great for us to know, are there potential toxins? We talked a little bit about the food industry last time, and if you're around me much, I do really look at the food industry as being a driver of our decisions and also a driver of our health. Because just like that cute little lady at Lifetime Fitness, she just didn't know. You don't know what you don't know. You go to H-E-B, you pull the things off the shelf, you put them in your cart. You could look at labels, but sometimes the labels don't give us all the information either. So it's really awesome to have an organization that we know and trust and can look up and get information from, that we feel like, okay, they have some good science-based information. But here's an example. Back in 2024, there was a monograph published, The State of Science Concerning Fluoride. Now, we all have heard the big conversation around fluoride. Is it safe? Is it not? And we just don't know. That's because for so many years, this has been questioned. We get information, and there's years and years of drafts, peer reviews, revisions, and ultimately they come to a conclusion. But there's so many layers of decision that it's really hard to bring it to the public because it's going to affect so many people. And so it's hard to know, will this big swath of information about fluoride trickle down to people that it will really matter with? So, that's still a big discussion, even though it wasn't that long ago that we came up with a fairly clear idea that there could be an association that affects IQ in children. So here's another one, the ROC, which is the Report on Carcinogens. Here's one that we really care about. So again, understanding how we can learn information, we can gather what matters to us, and try to make better decisions as we go through our, HEB shopping, but also, how we have activities outside. And so when we think about the science-based documents that they provide, it's really nice because it looks at products, agents, or even exposure circumstances that can pose a cancer risk. And a good example of one is also sunlight. It's so important that we get vitamin D, and it's so important that we get sunlight. But if you've been to a dermatologist, they will say sunscreen every time. 50 SPF. Make sure you always, always, always wear sunscreen. And so has that had any bearing on this, universal decline in our systemic stores of vitamin D? Who knows? But what this group does, the ROC, is they look at what products are known to be human carcinogens, this is a category, versus number 2, reasonably anticipated to be human carcinogens. So they put these, products or circumstances in categories of what is the risk of exposure. And, we really want to understand from long-term studies, from good science design, are we getting valid information? We see that many of these food products, for example, we found that we're pretty sure they are cancer causing, but they're still in foods. It's really tough to get them out of the food industry. There's so many ways that companies can still, get by regulations. And so we kind of are still in this whole idea of buyer beware. The consumer has a responsibility to make the best decisions they can. But again, like my little lady at Lifetime, you don't know what you don't know. And so that part scares me, that we always are trying to make good decisions. You all wouldn't be here if you didn't really want to know and want to make really good decisions. But it's scary because we don't always know who to trust. So, of the 256 listings, focus on hazard potential, noting individual susceptibility, duration of exposure, so many factors. Again, there's the risk that there's a lot of red tape. And will we ever have decisions based on the findings that are actually out there? And here's a few more. So the National Institute of Health, the American Cancer Society, and again, like I mentioned, your doctor. So again, the mission is to seek knowledge about the human body and apply this knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. The NIH seeks to make this information available for health decisions. So the NIH is great, and I know we all have used that as a resource. If you're not sure, you can check. You can always look at the NIH research. They are very much pivotal in the peer-reviewed process of looking at information. But if we don't have a squeaky wheel that says, acrylamide needs to come out of our food, it's not going to be pushed out very fast, because the companies, if they don't get the financial incentive to change their formula, it's probably not going to come out. Red dye is a big one right now that's being taken out. And that's really cool. Somebody has really pushed that agenda to try to get those chemicals known to the public so that then they can use their dollar to really vote with their dollar at HEB. But like I mentioned down at the very bottom, this is really the professional that you hire is your doctor, and to partner with you on your health. So together you accomplish a plan of care that avoids disease and promotes health and vitality. So the great thing is your doctor will and of course can know you well and help you navigate the decision. So if you have cancer in your family history, or you start seeing some physical signs, fatty liver, or your weight changing, or your insulin levels starting to look different, and of course that's always based on your fasting blood sugar. And what's cool now is you can even wear little monitors. Have you seen people with a little blood sugar monitor on their arm? And that's because these folks are really trying to track, where is my blood sugar? Postprandial, which is after a meal, how long does it take it to come back down? And what is a fasting level? There's so much, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, so much around spaced eating. So thinking about how do we reset our physiology, and there's really some exciting findings and research around this topic of we can actually reset some of these trends that might be happening in silent in our physiology. Oh, and before I leave this slide, just remember that the American Cancer Society is another really great one. You can get information there, but their main goal is to raise financial support. So they are a fundraising organization that has a wonderful connection to people to help them get resources. So a little different than the NIH and then, of course, of your doctor. So here we have factors in our lifestyle that really matters. My very first company was Nutrition Matters, and I still believe that it absolutely does. And it's kind of fun. Sometimes I have to get out my email and they'll read Nutrition Matters. Oh yeah, it does. And it's so good when we think about how much nutrition plays in our role of decisions. Sometimes they're kind of stealthy though, and we don't think they're so good or so bad. But when we get new information, it helps us to sort of realign what we're doing, and is it the best choice? Because the more we learn, the better we can impact the terrain of our bodies with factors that we have control over, and that's the part I just love. So, how much does weight matter? Well, we know that fat cells change the internal environment of our bodies, without a doubt. There's a lot that happens, increasing insulin production and decreasing the insulin sensitivity. So scenario is our muscle cells are starving because the sugar cannot get into the cell. And that's because of the insulin resistance. There's plenty of sugar out in the freeways, which is our bloodstream, but the active working mitochondria can't get to it. And so what does it do? The pancreas says, all right, I guess I'll just make more insulin. So we get more and more insulin up. Insulin resistance is still the issue, and so it really can't be effective. So of course, increases the chances of fatty liver and cardiovascular disease. So in this slide, the whole idea is insulin resistance is a spiral. And the culprit is highly refined sugars. We talked a little bit about this on the upside down pyramid. And again, it's really an exciting approach to help people understand what does it mean to have a carb that's highly refined. I think we all kind of get the idea that sugar is bad, especially you in this room because you're very well educated. But what do we mean by highly refined carbohydrates? What does it mean to have a highly processed carb? And what role does that have in the whole conundrum of insulin resistance? And so if we eat too many of any carbs, maybe, but it's pretty hard to eat too many of the naturally occurring carbs. What do I mean by that? Well, vegetables are naturally occurring. There hasn't been a lot of processing. Vegetables and brown rice and quinoa and beans and lentils. And sadly, on that food pyramid that's upside down, we don't really get to understand the nuance. They made it simple and said all carbs are bad, pretty much, with the little tiny grains right down at the bottom. But highly processed ones are the true culprit when we're looking at how insulin is affected, because the blood sugar rises and the pancreas responds. And the sad part about that insulin resistance is it also affects your energy level. So now you have fatigue, you feel yucky, your liver is sluggish, and of course, your fat cells start to get more and more of the nutrients. So if we were to do some meal planning for health, the good news is I think it's very reasonable, in fact, best case scenario, to get all foods in the food groups. Leave out the packaged foods, I think, is probably the smart approach, but for sure, we want to look at a well-balanced diet. And something that I think is a good takeaway, even from the food pyramid discussion, is that there isn't one perfect diet for every body. There's a lot of really great experts now sharing information, in the World Wide Web, and everybody's going to have their best answer. And kind of what I tried to suggest last week is that we really have this awesome personal responsibility to find out what works for us. And so, again, working with your healthcare team is such a great tool. And again, why people wear those little monitors, to really understand what your body is doing. When Debbie and I are in a fitness class together, we do Pilates, and sometimes the class will be really intense. And at the first part of the intense workout, your muscles are going, stop, I don't like this, this hurts. And then there's this little switch where all of a sudden the exercise starts feeling better. And that's when the fuel mix changes, and your muscles and the mitochondria in those working muscle cells start getting a lot more effective at burning that fuel. And so if you have insulin resistance and you're not feeling good, that switch doesn't happen nearly as well. And then to get those muscles well fueled, we've got to get a well mix of nutrients. On the internet, you'll always find experts that'll say, the carnivore is the only way to go, or vegan eating style is the only way to go. And my job is to help you see that there's a wide variety of great foods, and picking out which ones work for you is going to be your journey, and it's a real personal one. Also, write down this lady I was just mentioning, exercise for longevity. That's related to the first little one I wanted you to write down. But super interesting podcast, because again, she and the researcher talk about the study. It's hard to sometimes read research and really have a good takeaway. One, because usually research is very pinpointed. The data they're trying to get is really specific. And then, you think, well, how does that matter to me? So she does a good job of kind of pulling the scope back and saying, okay, so what you're saying is. And one of the things she talked about this morning is that when you engage in exercise, so profoundly important, 3 things. Not only the type of exercise, but the duration and the intensity. So getting up every morning and walking is awesome. But if that's all you do, there's 2 other components. We also have to think about the duration and the intensity. If you always walk for 20 minutes every morning for the past 20 years, will your body do another level of change? Probably not. You'll be really good at maintenance. And then if you check your blood levels, if you check your liver levels, and you're good, well, then your genetics and walking 20 minutes every morning work. If what you're doing isn't getting the results you need, and you start to see your blood sugar starting to go up, your triglycerides and your cholesterol are going up, maybe your waist circumference is going up, then we got to look back on, well, what other things in my exercise routine could I change? Really important. So I just love her. Because really, when we look at all these diet types, it's usually a result of thinking, well, what I'm doing isn't working, so I must need to eat vegan. Or what I'm doing isn't working, so I must need to eat keto. And that's probably not the right approach. Probably the right approach is to look at total calories in and total calories expended. So if you walk 20 minutes every morning, your body gets so good at that, the diminishing returns happens. Your body becomes so good at that you really don't burn that many calories. When you first started it and you were huffing and puffing and you got home after that 20 minutes and you wanted to sit down because you were tired, and then 20 years later, you're like, well, I didn't even feel that. And that's probably because your body is so good at that, we need to change it. We need to bring it up. And it's not always intensity. It can also be duration. So again, thinking about why we want to build our plate in a certain style, and could it have to do with exercise variability more than just food variability? So finding a love for fitness and doing it together. So when we think about what are the paradigms that really help in an anti-cancer way of life, a big one is social connection. Social connection, which is why the Diva and Dude program is so amazing. And having friends that you have had something similar in your life, similar age, similar demographics, all of those things are so cool. But also serving. So helping others is a profound way to help your own neurochemistry and physiology get healthier. There's something magical about community and about helping others that really does act like healthy medicine. So, when we think about the big categories of the anti-cancer way of life, of course, nutrition is big. We want to constantly learn. We want to constantly look at resources that we have at our disposal for knowing what carcinogens do we need to keep out of our diet, what macronutrients do we need to put in our diet. Is it a little more protein? Is it a little less fat? Right? Constant learning. And the other part is constantly being engaged in the community. So having, again, people that depend on you, people that make you feel loved and valued, because that is an intangible that we know without a doubt people that have longevity and health and wellness are a part of that. So it's really cool. So here I wrote down a little guideline, walking at least 30 minutes after dinner. So my little scenario of at breakfast is good, but if you want to now improve your insulin resistance, walking after dinner is huge. Huge, at least 30 minutes. And that isn't part of your exercise routine. I know, I just made it tougher, huh? That's just extra. That's just your relaxing, enjoying friendship, and seeing what the neighbors are doing in their yard. And don't forget that strength training is so important. I didn't put in my month of February bone health, but I was so torn because I love talking about bone health. It's so, so important. But I promise you that strength training is so critical. And don't let anybody tell you that Pilates is not a strength training exercise, because it is, right? It's all about what you make of it. And when you go to that lady's site, I forget her name, but Exercise for Longevity, a huge takeaway in most of her discussions around exercise are intensity. So that's that other one. And you can be doing housework and make it very low intensity. The flip side is you could be doing housework and making it high intensity, right? And there's a really great study they just talked about that was looking at what is the best kind of exercise, minute for minute. And it was clear that upper intensity exercise gives you the most benefits. But that could be anything. You could still do your 20-minute walk in the morning and make it more intense. You could be running with your dog. You could play chase. You could find some stairs and run up them. It doesn't have to be for 45 minutes on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. It could be spurts. And that's really exciting in the research around exercise, is that spurts of high intensity are great. So, thinking about how we mix it up keeps it a lot more fun. And also balance. Anybody ever take Tai Chi? I know you've got Tai Chi in the schedule. Tai Chi and yoga, and just on your own balance. In Pilates, I'll often have a step away from the reformer and work on standing on one foot and challenging ourselves with movement. And everybody's falling all over. It's because we don't do it enough. And what we find is that balance is so much a part of core strength. So you get a double whammy. You get neuromuscular connectivity and you get stronger core muscles when you work balance. So let's talk a little bit about recommendations. Here we've got this little blurb of intermittent fasting in the keto diet, kind of the new thing right now. And I pushed off intermittent fasting for years. I'm like, that's hogwash. We all fast because we go to bed and then we break the fast with breakfast. And I just kind of left it at that. But the research is so compelling. Next week, we're going to talk the whole hour about what does it mean to have intermittent fasting. It's a fancy term, but I promise you there is actually some really cool science specifically around the anti-cancer paradigm, which it makes me so excited. But when we think about the whole picture of anti-cancer and who's recommending what, this one is still going around and filling 2/3 of your plate with plant-based foods. The other 1/3 or less could be animal protein. Is that upside down compared to what we heard last week? Yeah, kind of. But I think what's really important is that something I mentioned last week is even though the pyramid's upside down, what really never lost its place? Veggies and fruit, especially veggies. So I could still work with that and believe that protein still needs to be higher, which again should be the takeaway from last week, that protein officially is higher. Remember, he said we ended the war on protein and we officially started the war on highly processed carbs. So that still works. And even if you did the keto diet, veggies and fruits are still part of it. You just get a very small amount. And remember, the keto phenomenon is around high fat, not really high protein, high fat. And what's the goal of the keto diet? To get rid of elevated insulin. So that, again, is all what it comes back down to. So if you think you might have elevated insulin levels, wear one of those trackers and see where are you during the day, because that could be a huge piece of information that will help you and your doctor decide what's my plan. How am I going to get this insulin level low and overall my blood sugar low? Because that is the magic bullet in all kinds of inflammatory-based diseases, which we know cancer is very much inflammatory based. And so the recommendations from, Fancy Pants MD Anderson to limit red meat and processed meat, I could at least go with that and say for sure limit processed meat. Now personally, I don't eat any red meat. There are still just enough experts that say the plant-based diet is still really good. Why? Because yes, you can get more protein on a plant-based diet. And two, if we eat plants, albeit free of glyphosate and other herbicides and pesticides, hard to find, but if we can focus our food sources there rather than animal protein, the chances of having carcinogen exposure is in fact less, because the animal has to eat all through its, 5 years? We don't exactly know what they're eating. They could have easily gotten some grain that had arsenic in it, and then it gets into our tissues because we've eaten its tissues. So many great experts will be on the side of the fence of the more protein from animals, the better. And then the other group will say, nope, the more plant foods, the better. And so there again, it all comes down to you get to choose what your mix is. Because we really want to make sure that whatever you do, the fruits and vegetables, especially vegetables, go high. So whenever I start with a new client, I say, well, the first thing I want us to do is increase your veggies. And they say, can I just put them in a smoothie? And I'm like, no, you cannot put them in a smoothie because then we miss out on ideal digestion. Mastication is the first stage of good digestion. So chew it up and it will not have an effect on your insulin levels, aka your blood sugar. So more on intermittent fasting soon. Oops, did I miss one? So this is another really big one that I love around all anti-inflammatory processes. We know that inflammation is a really big deal when it comes to diseases. Not only cancer, but of course diabetes and heart disease. And again, it all probably stems from that insulin resistance, which is part of that metabolic syndrome. So what could we take if there was going to be one supplement that would really help us? And it would be the king of anti-inflammatory, which is the omegas. And you've heard me say it before, and I guess I'll say it lots more times. We really don't want to heat the oil if we can avoid it. So again, cooking with oil is not as good as eating the food with fats added. So avocado toast, way, way, way better than avocado oil. I wouldn't give you $100 for a bottle of avocado oil. There's way too much processing. There's deodorizing agents. There's all kinds of chemicals that have to make those nasty avocados that they used into beautiful, good-smelling avocado oil. Another story. But walnuts, flax seeds, chia seeds, hemp hearts, organic butter. That's what's in the little melted dish, because it's really good for cooking. It could even be olive oil, who knows. But the idea is we don't want processed oils, and we don't want heated or cooked fats. What would be some other good, healthy, whole fats? Nuts, we mentioned, but hemp hearts, if you've known me for 5 minutes, I'm a big advocate. And hemp hearts are actually a great source of omega-6 as well as omega-3s. And there's a big, school of thought out there that if we take out all seed oils, we shouldn't, because we're going to miss some of the important omega-6 oils. Our body needs 3s and 6s to make all of the extra cells and neurochemistry that are built with fat. We need 6s and 3s. But it's a lot better to get the omegas in hemp hearts, the 6s, than it is corn oil or canola oil or safflower oil. Why? Well, because those oils have been heated and processed and denatured, et cetera, et cetera. The hemp seeds are just the way God made them. So definitely the way to go. Whole fats. So just a little hint, the benefits of this intermittent fasting. When we think about a normal day, what time do you have dinner? Maybe it gradually gets later and later. I don't know, maybe when we're retired, it gets earlier and earlier. But a good rule of thumb is if you have a natural cycle, you'll probably eat dinner maybe around 6. You take your 30-minute walk. You come home, you do some whatevers, and you get to bed maybe by 8:39. You're going to say, Suzanne, that's crazy. None of the good shows are over by then. The idea is that proper amount of sleep is not 6 hours. It's not 7 hours. It's probably more like 9 hours, especially when we've got to recover from challenging days, whether it be doctor's visits, whether it be anxiety, or doing a lot of fitness. So more sleep is most likely required. And really, our normal cycle of a day does allow for a break fast. You have a fast in the evenings, unless you're an ice cream eater, you eat at midnight, you have your snacks. That would be a really good challenge to stop. Really good challenge to stop. Because if you allow your natural fasting cycle, you easily can get 12 hours. Now, some super exciting research says that you can reduce your chance of recurrence of cancer by like 60% if you fast for a minimum of 13 hours. So 13 to 16 hour fast now gives you enough time for your body to cleanse all of the stuff that you ate during the day so that your blood sugar can go down. And remember, I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the most important thing is avoiding insulin resistance. And that happens when there's too much food going on and the cells can't get their nutrients because something's happening to the health of that cell. It's not absorbing the sugars. The insulin is not doing its job. So insulin resistance can be recalibrated and turned off with a longer fast. Super cool. So improve metabolism, so improving your hormones, not to mention the insulin, but other hormones as well. Fasting may improve your brain from aging. I mean, there's so much exciting stuff around Alzheimer's disease. And with the passing of my hubby, I was really studying Alzheimer's. I thought it was so interesting that our brain stops having ideal metabolism, just like our bodies stop having ideal metabolism when the sugars are high, even subtly high. So again, a normal range of fasting sugar of 100 is upper limit, but your doctor might not put you on medicine, but it sure doesn't mean you don't want to put yourself on some new rigor. So, and then of course for heart health, so it can lower cholesterol and reduce risk factors of heart disease, all because you just didn't have your bedtime snack. And I remember it wasn't that long ago for diabetics that we were taught to teach our type 2 and type 1 diabetics, make sure you have a bedtime snack so you won't have the sundowners. Remember that? I see some heads nodding. Yes. And so again, it's, we learn new information. We have to kind of reinvent what we talk about because that doesn't work anymore. because it's better if that diabetic then can have a longer fast. Again, type 2. A type 1 diabetic is a different story. But if that type 2 diabetic person or just has, elevated sugars, if they are able to increase the period of time where their GI tract is resting along with sleeping, there's great changes that happen during that fast. Now, it's a whole different story when we look at intermittent fasting during the day. But there's a really cool research that I'm going to share with you next week that actually does inpatient work on very long fasts, 5 days to 40 days. I know, I cannot imagine. They just get water fast, right? And that's so foreign to us because we think of, well, I don't want to go through that pain. I mean, that is excruciating pain. I don't know that I could go without lunch, let alone 5 days worth. And in fact, in this one podcast he did, they showed the plates. There's like 122 plates. That's how many meals they had to miss to go through this program. But it's amazing, ladies, that lymphoma, this one lady cured. There's been several cancer patients that after the 10-year mark still don't have cancer. Heart disease, of course, irritable bowel and all kinds of GI issues. So again, extremes, but his records show 25,000 people in the last 40 years have gone through his process and have had truly remarkable improvements. Now, even if we take an idea from that and just expand our nighttime fast, I think that's a good start. Knowing the biology around it could be really valuable. And again, he's working with people that he's monitoring their electrolytes. He's monitoring, lots of things, just giving them water. But they survive and they come out so much better. And if you hear the talk around people that do intermittent fasting, even for religious reasons, the Daniel fast, The Daniel fast is for a week. The Jewish tradition has fasts. Many religions have fasts, and people not only do it to have a closer spiritual connection, but they also come out of it feeling remarkable, both mentally as well as physically. So it's a really interesting thing. Again, I poo-pooed it for a long time, but when I heard that there was this really exciting research around the anti-cancer way of life, because of you all, my ears perked up, because I just love the idea that what if we could increase our longevity, but also increase our quality of life with some small changes. And it wouldn't have to be earth-shattering to take a walk after dinner and forego the snacks at night. I think we just get in the habit. We buy yummy foods. H-E-B sells them all the time. So the first step might be to not buy them, because at night it's so tempting. If they're there, we're going to want them, right? And so whenever I start with somebody new, I always say, first goal is to commit with your family that you're just not going to buy chips anymore. And I know some people go, that's just not going to happen. My husband would never allow that. And alas, it might be true. But little steps, and the best feedback is when you start going, wow, I feel so much better. I feel so much better that now the feedback mechanism is, well, I want to keep doing something that makes me feel better.